everybody, welcome to another edition of Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. I have a great guest coming on today, Marc Victor. He's known as the attorney for freedom. He's at attorneyforfreedom.com. I've known him off and on or through different people and through meeting at conferences every now and then for a number of years. And sort of a funny quick story to get started. I actually called him one day because I was in Las Vegas, and the Dollar Vigilante's chief researcher, Justin O'Connell, was in a bar with me in one of those giant casino bars, lounges, or whatever you call them, and he spilt his drink. And we had just walked in, we had just paid $35 each to walk in, and he wasn't drunk or anything, he just accidentally spilt his drink. About 4 bouncers took him out, and he just sort of asked, he said, well, I just walked in, can I get my money back? And then they called the police, and then I saw about 10 police officers literally swarm on him, and there was nothing I could do, and that was the last I saw of him for at least 36 hours. And so I actually called Marc's office, and I don't remember if it was Marc I think it was Marc who called me back. It was like Sunday morning or something. And yeah, it was so good, and he told us what we needed to do. It was amazing, like totally amazing. And this is the kind of stuff he does. He's an anarchist, he's a lawyer, and he's actually against the prohibition on drugs and all that kind of stuff. Amazing guy, and you're going to want to know who this person is. Let's get it started right off the bat, though, Marc. I got to check your credentials. How did you become an anarchist?
Well, you know, Jeff, I generally try to get labels. I hate labels, and I hate labels for the reason that the second you throw a label out there, somebody knows everything about you. So I try not to label myself anything more than pro-freedom, although to me, take the word libertarian, a real libertarian and an anarchist, as we might use the term, which is an anarcho-capitalist, are really the same thing. Sometimes I like to use the word autarkist because, just to be a little more precise, I'm for self-rule. I'm not for no rule, I'm for self-rule, and I'm for iron-fisted dictatorship of myself. So how'd I get there? Well, I came to law school a real solid Republican. I was a fan of Rush Limbaugh and probably Ronald Reagan. And then I ran into Butler Shaffer. And Butler Shaffer really had a huge influence on me. I mean, this guy, Butler doesn't answer any questions. And so he really believes in the Socratic method. And so Butler just posed a lot of questions. And he posed some very, very good questions. And I can remember a long period of time where I would go to Butler's office almost every day after law school with a brand new question about how on earth something could work without the government regulating it. And I would go in there and say, hey, you know, Butler, without the government running X, we'd have complete chaos, some variety of that question. And of course, Butler would look at me and say, yeah, sounds about right. And I would say, well, see, there you go. We need government for something. And he would say to me the simple question, well, what do you think would happen after that, Marc? And of course, I would respond with, well, I mean, of course, this would happen, some other horribly chaotic thing. And then Butler would just simply say, well, what do you think would happen next? And then, of course, parade me down the road until I would get to the point where I would say, oh, yeah, I guess that does kind of make sense. And then I would leave satisfied for the moment, and then I'd go home and I'd sort of think up another area that we absolutely positively needed the government. It was really a great experience because rather than sort of hitting me over the head with, God damn it, coercion and force and all this stuff is really bad, he just sort of let me wrap my brain around it. And then once I got it, it just made sense to me. And I like to present it like this. Either you think that we can have a nice, civilized, productive society without having the need to hit our neighbors over the head, or you don't. And I've come to the conclusion that I think I can live just a fine life without any problems, without any need whatsoever to coerce my neighbor into anything at all. And so if that makes me pro-freedom, anarcho-capitalist, libertarian, I don't know. I generally don't like constitutionalist because that doesn't really mean much of anything. But that's how I got there.
That's great. Were you a lawyer already when you came to this understanding, or was that later?
I was in law school.
Oh, you were in law school.
I was in my first year of law school, and I, of course, thought I knew everything. I had it all figured out, and I never even heard the word libertarian. And, you know, Butler just brought this on. You know, since then, this is really an easy case to make, I think. I don't know if you saw my speech at Doug Casey's event I did a speech in Tucson a year ago, and I recently gave a speech in San Antonio. And, I was really talking to people who describe themselves as pro-freedom, and everybody says they're for freedom, right? I could go to any crowd on the planet and say, raise your hand if you're for freedom, and everybody raises their hand. But I challenged them a little bit, and I basically told them, to me, you could put all human interactions in one or the other box, which is voluntary or involuntary. We can argue about a little which box it ought to get into, but all we're saying, really, we being those of us who are for peace and freedom, is if it's in the voluntary box, it ought to be legal. Doesn't mean you have to like it or think it's good, or I may even try to talk you out of it. But if it's a voluntary transaction between consenting adults, it ought to be legal. And if it's in the other box, it ought to be illegal. And recognizing that you could still have a moral code that has nothing to do with that. That's really all we're arguing for. And I tried to make the case at Casey's event that a lot of people like to talk about peace, but I don't think you can really talk about peace until you hit freedom, right? Until we get to the point where we're at least not hitting each other over the head and coercing each other into things. We can't even talk about peace. Once we get to freedom, then we can talk about an additional component. And the example I like to use sometimes is, two neighbors could come out of their homes and flip each other off in the morning and call each other names and this and that. And as long as they're not trespassing, you got perfect freedom. There's no issue with freedom, but they're certainly not at peace. I like to say peace is something in addition to that. So the day we hit a free society is the day I become a peace activist, because I really would like to come out of my house and say to my neighbor, hey man, how are you? How's your life going? What can I help you with? And be a good neighbor. That's about peace. And so I see this as a great opportunity to start a conversation, because it's popular to wear peace symbols, right? So I generally like to stop people and compliment them on their nice peace symbol, and then start talking to them about freedom, and then be very confused when they're not even for freedom. How could you possibly be for peace when you're still for coercing your neighbor?
Yeah, actually, well said. And actually right up here on our little logo there is a spinning anarchy logo and a peace sign and a heart, because they're all tied together. Anarchy is a philosophy of peace and love. But you're totally right that we can't really get there unless we have freedom first. And totally right. And I've never heard it said that way, and well said. And of course, you're a good speaker. You wouldn't be a good lawyer if you weren't. And I did see your speech at the Casey Research Conference. It was excellent, of course. And
the recent one in San Antonio?
It was the one about the police state.
Oh, that was the last one in Tucson.
Okay.
So this one was a more hardcore pro-freedom speech, if you can believe that, than the last one.
That's great. Well, it was really interesting just to hear your views, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you see, because you're in this every day, and we don't want to take too much of your time, because I know you're incredibly busy, because of course you do live in a police state, so you have no limit to the amount of people who need your help right now, and I don't want to keep them away from you too much. But why don't you just tell us your perspective on what you're seeing, being in the system, what's going on, and how bad it's getting?
Well, everything is about perspective. I think perspective is the most important word in the English language, and I think love is really super important and all that, but perspective is key. And so, as I said in that talk, I could give you 5 reasons for why I'm really pessimistic about how things are going, but I could also give you 5 reasons about why I'm optimistic. And overall, I'm an optimist, and so I think that we're at a very good period of time. This is an really exciting time to be alive right now for so many reasons. I mean, we could just talk about technology and the rate of increase, like the fact that we're doing a radio show on Skype and like this, and I can look at you and you can look at me and you're far away. It's just incredible. And we don't need the government to be involved in this. We just do it through the internet at fairly low cost. That by itself is incredible. And that's old technology, right? So that's a good reason. But, this whole thing about the drug war, I find a lot of optimism there. I mean, the drug war as to marijuana, it's over. Some people haven't realized it yet. But it's crumbling everywhere, and there, of course, are, not to say it's not dangerous still, it is. People on the wrong side of this argument are now really gearing up and trying to crunch down hard, but the handwriting is on the wall, and the drug war as to marijuana at least is over. and I think marijuana will be legal everywhere, probably in the world very soon. That'll be the norm. We'll look back on it and say, wow, just like we feel about at the alcohol days where the Budweiser driver, went to prison and we got into arguments about how many beers were on the Budweiser truck and how ridiculous that sounds, but that's where we are with marijuana. But this is really a very good opportunity for us to make the case as people who are for freedom to say, wait a second, there's a great argument here about economics and the black market and all this other stuff, but we don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about something totally different. It's not about whether marijuana is good for you or bad for you or any of this other stuff. It's about the right of the individual to control his or her own body. It should go without saying, but just to be safe, we're not talking about kids, and we're not talking about people who don't have the mental capacity to be in charge of themselves. They need guardians. I'm talking about the competent adult, which is most people, the vast majority of people, and they're the ones who should be deciding what goes in their body. If we can win that argument, and I think we got a great opportunity to make it, this is so much bigger than marijuana, right? We can make the same argument about taxes. It's the same question. We can make the same argument about prostitution. It's the same question. So many of these issues are exactly the same question. Who's in charge of you? You or somebody else? Right? To us, it's a simple question.
Yeah, it is a really interesting time to be alive. There's so many things changing right now, and I've commented a lot on the end of the drug war as I see it. I see it happening all over. I'm actually been investing in medical marijuana companies around the world. I've been helping to get some of them started, and so it's exciting. But at the same, I should say a little bit more that I think if we can get all prohibition of all drugs, which actually the UN is now talking about, which is weird because I always distrust the UN, so I don't know what their little scheme is this time, but maybe they do have some okay people there or something, because if they can legalize all drugs worldwide, very quickly people would start to question, why do we even need government? Because I thought that's what they're checking everyone for, was plants, and he might have cocaine and that sort of thing. And then they'll say terrorists, and then it's like, well, the real terrorists are the government. So yeah, it goes downhill pretty fast from here if things keep progressing.
Yeah, and I think overall, some people might say I'm crazy on this point, and I'm talking in a macro type of a sense here, but overall, people are becoming more libertarian because it's a more enlightened, more rational type of a position. I mean, we're getting the notion kind of like we got when we were in kindergarten. If you want to play with someone else's toys, you don't just grab them, right? You get to ask permission and things like that. We're kind of getting that. And so, I've seen some articles about how libertarianism is now the new middle. And I think that we're pulling from what used to be the Democrats and what used to be the Republicans. And the reason I say that is because there's really nothing that distinguishes the two parties that I can see of any value here. But the old school Democrats that sort of had some respect for individual liberties and civil rights, and the old school Republicans that had some concept of a free market economy and those types of things. Those things are both kind of merging into the libertarian world. And we've got, we had Ron Paul in a presidential debate. Yeah, he had an R next to his name, but Ron and I know Ron, and Ron's a pretty principled, libertarian, pro-freedom kind of guy, and he was up there hammering away on the things that we like to have people say, which is peace and freedom. And now Rand Paul is coming behind him. And look, I don't know Rand personally. I've never met him. But I have it on fairly good authority that Rand is really a freedom guy, despite the fact that he's playing in that cesspool called politics, and he's probably saying some things to get votes. Look, at this point, I'm interested in, what do you really believe? Are you really a pro-freedom person? If he's got to say some things to get some votes, look, every other politician has done this, right? Obama ran on a platform of peace and things of that nature, and then couldn't wait to get there and crank up the war machine. So if Rand Paul talks about appeasing some people with smaller government, and really he's moving towards what I like to call no coercion, because this is I think an important point too. It's really not about government. My beef is not with government. My beef is with coercion. I don't care what you call it. As long as there's no coercion, you could call it a government all you like. If it's not coercing people into doing things, I'm perfectly fine with it. And there are some traditional things that, governments have done that are perfectly fine, like namely protecting liberty, protecting rights, stopping trespassers, tracking them down, figuring out if they really are the trespasser or not. Those are legitimate functions, whether it's done by a private group of people or something that you call a government. I don't care what you call it. I care, is it initiating force against people? If it is, I'm against it, and if it isn't, I'm for it.
Yeah, I agree, and I've said before that government doesn't really exist. It's just people in costumes listening to other people in costumes committing massive crimes, and so it's really just
interesting that you say that, because that's exactly how I started my speech. Doug gave me the title of The Broken State and How to Fix It, and I opened up with, let's talk about it. There really isn't a state. There is not a state. There are some people who boss other people around. We really need to look at it in those terms, right? Because we sort of glorify this big concept, oh, the state is wanting this or that. But at the end of the day, it's one group of thugs who are bossing other people around. And all we're trying to say is we need more people who are saying, look, I don't want to boss anybody around, and I don't want to be bossed around.
Yeah, absolutely. One of your most recent things that you wrote about was you're protecting, or you're a lawyer for someone who's been attacked by the government, or the people who say they're with the government for gun sort of related issues. What's your take on the whole gun thing in the U.S. right now? What are you seeing on the ground? Are they getting more aggressive about taking away people's guns?
Well, I may be a little jaded because I live in Arizona, and Arizona is generally a pretty pro-gun kind of place. I mean, of course, this gun issue, really, there's only one position here that makes sense to me, which is peaceful people. I don't care what they do. If they're peaceful, by definition, I don't care what they have or what they're doing. It's none of my business. And so peaceful people with guns, and what I mean by that are people who are responsible and they're not storing their weapons or using their weapons in ways that are endangering other people. Why would I be the least bit concerned about people with any kind of a weapon who are peaceful? And I'm not. In fact, I would want to encourage as many peaceful, for selfish reasons, right? What if I'm unarmed somewhere and there's some crazy lunatic with a gun? We know how the crazy lunatic with gun thing plays out, right? Either crazy lunatic shoots him or herself, usually himself, or somebody else with a gun shows up and stops crazy lunatic. So the more peaceful people we have with guns out there, the better. But this is really a hot debate. Some people think this may be the new civil war in the United States, because there really are a lot of people who blame the inanimate object, the gun, for things that somebody does with the gun, which is, very crazy to me. So I think that I don't know how this is going to shake out. I certainly hope that the people for freedom prevail in this, and there's going to have to be some. Look, the people sometimes on our side, they get carried away, and everybody's looking for bright line rules on things, and life just doesn't fit comfortably into bright line rules. And so there are some people who are not competent to have firearms. I've met some of them. I've represented some of them. There are people out there, and it may not be their fault at all. They may have some mental incapacitation that causes them to be unsafe with weapons. We have to have some process to figure out who those people are. And if they truly are people who are not competent, maybe they shouldn't have guns, but maybe they shouldn't be driving cars. I mean, there's lots of things that people who are not competent shouldn't be doing. So that's the kind of thing, Jeff, that I think that, if you have lots of communities with different rules all trying to figure this out, I don't have a big beef with that. You guys figure out how you get to that, as long as we're on the same page with the important principles that we don't want to coerce people. I think that whatever, and there are lots of questions just for the fun of it. If you and I were sort of hanging out and we had 5 hours, I'd probably pull out my iPhone and get to my notes section where I keep a long running list of things that libertarians like to argue about that they don't agree on. And there are lots of things, and I made this point in my talk too. We're not utopians, right? We're not trying to say the world will be perfect in a free society. There still will be bad people who will trespass. There will still be mistakes in justice, right? Innocent people will still get convicted. Guilty people will still go free. And I'm talking about people who are guilty of real crimes. I mean, bad things will still happen. We're not utopians. But all we're saying is the rules themselves, the basic principles, the concepts, those ought to be consistent and be pro-freedom. How we implement them can get a little messy, and there's not great rules sometimes there that one size fits all.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, actually, one of the sort of funny things to think about is about Nazi Germany, which was a really interesting time. The Nazis were generally not very good, as many people know, and then the Nazis were sort of absolved. And so what happened to the Nazis? Well, those were just people, so they just went into society. There's still sort of, a lot of them were really sociopathic sort of people. They enjoyed doing those sort of things, but they didn't have that power of this giant system at that point to really do, terrible things. They just sort of, screw things up in their own neighborhood from then on, or maybe torture a cat or something. It wouldn't be anywhere near as bad. And I should say that I actually am pro-gun control in the hands of cops. The most dangerous people in the U.S. today seem to be the police. Have you been noticing? Like you talked about in your speech, it seems to be getting absolutely insane.
Well, I am getting a lot of this, but, I hate to generalize and make bright line rules. And, this is coming from Marc Victor, who's a hardcore pro-freedom guy in the trenches for 20 years, interviewing cops for that whole time. There are some really good ones out there. There are some very good peace officer type police officers there who are looking for old school bad guys, the kind that leave a victim in their path. And they don't care about enforcing this stupid stuff. And we need more of those. And, I had one of those police officers said to me recently, I was having a discussion about the militarization of the police, which is a hot topic. And he said to me, look, Mark, I'm a good guy. I understand. I agree with everything you're saying. But some of these bad guys got really big guns. And if the bad guys are showing up with grenade launchers and all kinds of serious weapons, what am I supposed to run after them with a pea shooter? And he had a good point there. And so, a point that I made in an article I wrote about Thomas Jefferson, I think that it isn't about whether the people fear the government or the government fear the people. In a free society where the laws were all consistent with free market principles and concepts that we like, I wouldn't care about the law enforcement officer who enforced every single law. The guy we hate now, the guy that writes your ticket for every single thing. Well, if every single thing were consistent with libertarian principles, in other words, there was a trespass there, then the guy who tags you for trespassing on someone's property, I don't have such a beef with that person. And there's no need to make a distinction between the peace officer and the law enforcement officer. And if the rules are consistent and the police officers are acting in accordance, I don't really have a problem with them having sufficient weapons to deal with bad guys, real bad guys with those kind of weapons. So as I've said on many occasions, we need to get away from all these sort of little squabbles and get to the point of what really matters, which is convincing enough people to win hearts and minds for liberty and for freedom. If we can do that, all this other stuff will take care of itself.
I agree. That's what I've been trying to do for the last 5 years or so, is just sort of spread this message. That's the only way we're going to win. It's not going to be won through violence, that's for sure. Fighting the government, that's not going to do anything good, in my opinion, at this point especially. And by just harping on these things all the time and not really spreading the actual philosophy itself doesn't really help tremendously either, because as you pointed out, it's really about just getting people to understand what's really going on and understanding what freedom is and how great it can be. And it's not going to be perfect, like you pointed out, but it's going to be a lot different. But it's going to be so much better and so much more peaceful and more prosperous. And the fun thing for me is I've kind of been all around the world, so I've seen all kinds of different countries and the way they're run. And so I've seen countries like Cambodia right now are almost completely anarchic, and it's so nice to be there. I was there for like a week about maybe 8 months ago. I didn't see a cop the entire time, totally peaceful. There's obviously some problems. Some people might steal something from a store or something, but then half the block will just chase the guy down the street or whatever, or they'll have a security guard or something like that. And it's just such a better life. And then you see other places where they have just so much more government controls, and you just kind of feel it. You can kind of sense it. Just doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel very free at all, and it isn't. So you're actually in the Phoenix area most of the time, and so I just want to quickly just see if you have any Sheriff Joe stories.
Well, actually, I do my own radio show, the Attorney for Freedom show, and we scheduled Sheriff Joe Arpaio to come on my show, and I don't know if he knew initially when it was agreed, because somebody else set it up whose show it was, but he wandered into my studio and we sat down, and people were sort of taking over-unders on how long it would take for the sheriff to sort of get up and say, I've had enough of this, and leave. But I gotta say, he stayed the whole hour, and we had a very good conversation. And what was refreshing about the guy was at least he speaks his mind. I mean, from a starting point, I want to have a discussion with somebody who at least is has integrity in terms of what their position is. And I don't feel that when I'm talking to most politicians. I don't know, are you really shining me on, or do you believe what you're saying? So regardless of what your position is, it's nice to speak to somebody who at least is putting it out there. And I felt that way with him. We didn't agree on a lot of things. We agreed on some things. He evaded many of my questions. I asked him questions like, well, I understand the law is the law. And I was going to say something about the Nazis, because I go back to that a lot. When you raise the Nazis, I bring it up. I think it's something we should never forget. And remember, the law was the law there. There was only one judge in Nazi Germany who refused to enforce the laws of the Nazis. And I thought that was disgusting. So this is the most common story defense I get from prosecutors when I hammer them, which I often do. They sometimes will say, look, Mark, I agree with you, but the law is the law. And I say back to them, you're still accountable for what you do. Don't think you're off the hook just because you've been blessed by some government. Neither were the high-end Nazis who went to the Nuremberg trials. Getting back to Arpaio, I said to him, what is your personal position about legalization of marijuana? He said, well, if they change the law, I'll enforce it, whatever they tell me the laws. I said, I get that, but what is your personal position? Whatever they tell me to enforce is what I said, I get it. So we went round and round a few times. But, you know, I got to say, at the end of the interview, he had a very endearing personality. I understood very clearly why the guy's been elected and reelected. You want to like the guy. You feel like he'd be a cool guy to hang out with and talk to. Who knows what his personal views are on this. I think the reason he evaded my question is because he knows better than to get into an argument with me about that. Because who would possibly argue for the drug war today, and what would possibly be the argument? I wouldn't even know where to begin to try to make that case. I goof around with the DEA guys sometimes when we're off the record and it's just me and them. I say, hey man, how's that drug war going? We gonna win it anytime soon? You got any fresh new ideas coming out? I mean, we've only been fighting it since the 1960s, and how are we doing on that? None of them do anything other than laugh when I say that, because every single one of them, they know that this is a complete disaster. But what they generally say back to me is, you know, Mark, this thing, it's a job, and that's why I do it. And that's really the big danger here with the government being so big, is so many people are on the payroll of the government that you and I can bring a great argument about a free society, but there are so many people who are benefiting from coercion now, like Barack Obama. You and I could sit him down and talk to him till we're blue in the face about the benefits of a free society. But honestly, he could look us back and say, look, guys, I do better as king of the empire right now, and I'm not going to have a better life as in a free society. And he's exactly right. So this is a big danger when you get more and more people who are benefiting as a result of this coercion, or as Bastiat called, legalized plunder. And it's a real problem. And we got to try to appeal to the sense of morality to these people and say, look, even if you're doing better as a thug, you know, as a free guy, you could still do okay. And it's still wrong to make your living off of stealing other people's money.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that is going to be one of the biggest issues, especially in the U.S., with so many people are dependent on the government for so many things, whether it's working for the government. There's so many because they've started to make everything government related, of course, with Obamacare and all that, and, socializing medical care. And there's 50 million people on food stamps. There's, I think, 11 states with more people on welfare than who have jobs. So, yeah, it's really hard, you know, because these are people, a lot of them talk about people on food stamps, people on welfare and all that. Like, if you try to sit them down and say, hey, this would be better, they'd be like, well, no, it won't, not for me, not at least for a few months, because I'm going to stop getting those checks. The thing that's sort of, you kind of have to sort of mention is that those checks are not going to be coming much longer anyway, so get prepared now. And so, yeah, that's going to be a really interesting time. I just saw sorry, my video just stopped here. I'm just going to see what happened, but I'm recording on 2 cameras, so it's fine. I just saw a video in Ferguson, I think it was, or someplace like that, and the person said to the cop, you know, or no, it was somewhere in the U.S., some cop was really aggressing against somebody, and the person said, you know, I thought this was the land of the free, and the guy said, I don't feel very free right now, and the cop said, I do. So it's all kinds of, it gets really warped once you get into these government things. That's why the founding fathers and all this sort of people kind of warned against all these things, including central banks, which are heinous, and having a standing army. Now look what happened. It's really, it's difficult. It's difficult times, and it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. I know you're very busy, but feel free to comment on whatever you want. But I do want to just sort of let people know who you are and what you can do if someone does get into trouble, how they can contact you, that sort of a thing.
I'm the easiest guy on the planet to get a hold of. All you got to do is go to Google and put Marc Victor in. But my website is Attorney for Freedom. I mean, what else would it be besides attorneyforfreedom.com? And anybody can always get a hold of me during my website. I do major felony cases, and I do them across the nation. I have been to several different states on federal cases and even state cases. And so I will travel if the case is right. And I love fighting the government for people. And it can be a tough fight. And, my clients know that I always fight really hard for them because I have a passion for fighting the government. Because, look, most of the people I represent, and this is one of the worst things I ever say as a criminal defense lawyer. I say, look, I do major felony cases, and most of the people who I represent, I wouldn't mind having as my next door neighbor. Now, could you imagine in a truly free society that's based on correct pro-freedom, libertarian-type principles, what I should say is I represent a lot of people charged with major felonies. I would never want them knowing where I live because each one of them has initiated force and things, or at least are accused of doing that. The people today, even if they're totally guilty of the crime they're charged with, most of them, I still wouldn't mind living next door to my wife and kids. That's a horrible thing for a criminal defense lawyer to say.
Yeah, it's crazy. There's so many things that are legal in the U.S. now, and so many people are getting wrapped up into it. So it's good that there's people like yourself out there, and I can attest you are amazing how quickly to get a hold of you. You even have a fridge magnet, if I'm correct. Is that right?
Yes, we do, and I always recommend put it at the bottom, just so when they come in and they slam you to the ground and they put the boot in your face, as long as your head's facing the right direction, you can get a good glimpse at the phone number. But, in all seriousness, and another reason I'm sort of optimistic about this, I mean, we look at guys like Jefferson and John Adams and Sam Adams, and they're heroes of freedom. In a lot of ways they are. What they did was very courageous. But on the other hand, if we were sitting with them, me and you and say Thomas Jefferson, and we were just sort of chatting about freedom, don't you think at some point you or I would say to Thomas Jefferson, look, Thomas, I know you're for freedom and all that, and we're talking about the virtues of freedom, but you never freed your slaves. You guys didn't even get past the point of enslaving other human beings. I understand the concept that it was illegal, but come on your deathbed, you didn't even free them. And I don't care. I would free, if I had human slaves and it was illegal, I would free them this second and deal with the consequences. And so my point here is a lot of people would agree with that. So when we started this sort of experiment, the United States, it was really flawed from the beginning. The freedom guys of the day really weren't so wonderful in terms of freedom. And I see this as an opportunity to maybe reboot. We know so much more about freedom at this point. There's no arguments about slavery. We're talking about regulation, right? I mean, we're so much more advanced than the average hero of freedom was at that time. It seems like we at least would have a pretty good shot to have a revolution. And I mean revolution in the sense that the founders meant it, which was not a war, not violence, a revolution in thinking. And we need to get back to this discussion about what is the proper role of government. And we need to make the case that, look, government is our agent. They're there to protect our rights. Their job is not to be my mommy or daddy or take care of me from cradle to grave. And that's really the main argument that we're having with the people on the other side. What is the nature and the role of government?
Absolutely. Well said. Well, I know you got to get out there and free some more slaves or people who have been kidnapped and imprisoned for victimless crimes. So I want to let you get back to that, but I'd like to really thank you for being on with us, Marc.
All right, buddy, I really appreciate it. And you can get a hold of me anytime through my website. And it's nice chatting with you.
You too. So that's it for Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. Peace, love, and anarchy.
Thanks, buddy. Right back at you.
All right. Thank you, Marc. That was great.
This is Anarchast.